Welcome to Creepy Loop. Join us for a spine-chilling journey as we unfold the mysterious tale of Joan, lost in a nightmare that takes unexpected turns. Follow her encounters with strangers, haunted diners, and a lurking menace. Don't miss the dark secrets awaiting in the shadows. Like and subscribe for more eerie stories. Joan didn't want to wake up early, but she had to because of her job. She was still half asleep when she reached for her phone on the table next to her bed. The annoying alarm had been ringing for 5 minutes, but she finally turned it off. Instead of noticing that her phone had a low battery, she just looked at the time and felt upset because it was already 4:06, and she had to leave for work in less than an hour. Her phone was playing music because she liked falling asleep to songs. She reluctantly stopped the music, took out her earbuds, and got out of bed. Joan had to go to the biggest city in the state, which was 45 miles away from her new house. Her house was in a place called Nowhere, in the southern US, surrounded by a forest. Still not fully awake, Joan put on her work uniform, a white t-shirt, shorts, and sandals. She walked like a zombie into her messy backyard, which was basically just the end of the forest behind her house. Joan got into her car, or actually, it was an old yellow pickup truck her parents gave her. It used to belong to her brother, but when he got a new one for graduating, they gave this old truck to Joan. It happened when she was in college, and on that day, she moved out of her parents' house. They also stopped giving her money, calling her ungrateful. Since then, Joan had to figure out how to make a living on her own because she couldn't afford college anymore. She wanted to prove to her parents that she could do well without their help. It just wasn't working. Joan sat in her old truck, thinking about things, when a loud sound of leaves made her jump. She quickly started the truck. Then, she remembered why she got her house so cheap. It was in a really bad area, surrounded by forests, on a bumpy road with no name. Nobody ever drove on that road, and the few houses there were probably empty. As Joan drove, the road got smoother, and she saw lights from gas stations and fast food places. The round moon was shining bright, making her feel a bit better. In a few more miles, there would be hotels and a small mall. Right next to them was the interstate, and once she was on it, she could relax and daydream until her exit. But for now, she was nervous. The town she lived in wasn't safe. She knew that from the moment she moved there. She couldn't afford to live in her hometown where her friends were, so she got the only house she could afford, even though it was far from her friends. She hadn't made any friends in her new town, and she wasn't sure if she even wanted to. She often escaped from the town whenever she had enough money for gas, visiting friends or going to the closest movie theater or restaurant. But the truth was, it was a very lonely life. Joan had a big problem in her life, finding a husband. She always dreamed of a handsome man who would take away all her problems. Even though many guys liked her, none of them stuck around. Joan still remembered a bad date with a guy named Austin, who was also her co-worker at the community pool where she worked as a lifeguard. She didn't like her job, but it was the only one she could do with her certification, even though it wasn't a degree. Austin was the one who usually worked the early shift she was driving to that day. They had a fight on their date, and he called in sick the next day. Joan had to cover for him, and it annoyed her because Austin often made up excuses to skip work. One time, he said his dog had attacked someone's cat, and the cat's owner wouldn't let him leave for work. Joan's boss thought these stories were lies, but he couldn't fire Austin because it was hard to find lifeguards in the fall and winter. Joan didn't like taking Austin's shift, but she couldn't say no. This job was important, and she couldn't risk losing it. As Joan drove down the road, she couldn't stop thinking about Austin. She wondered if she loved him and if he would come back to work after their bad date. She also wondered if they would go on another date or even see each other again. Austin was a bit grumpy and mysterious, but that just made Joan want him more. All these thoughts filled her mind until she realized the road had gotten really dark, with forests on both sides instead of streetlights. She got confused, thinking the ramp onto the interstate should be close. She kept driving, looking for the turn, and suddenly, she panicked when she realized she must have missed it. Joan started to feel really scared. She wanted to stop the truck and figure out what was going on, but it seemed like the truck had its own plans, and it wasn't heading to work. Finally, she gathered the courage to slow down and see where she was. The problem was, she had no clue. She had just moved to this town and never wanted to explore it because it seemed far away and unsafe. Now she regretted not knowing more about it. This road seemed to go on forever, and there was no way to get off. She thought about turning around, even though the road was supposed to be one way. But she saw some dim headlights behind her, so she didn't want to risk a crash. Joan also thought about stopping and asking the car behind her for directions, but she decided against it. The people in this town might not be very friendly, she figured. Feeling worried, Joan reached for her phone in her pocket. She wondered who she could call for help. When she saw that her gas was almost empty, and the road kept stretching on, it made her even more anxious. Joan held onto the steering wheel tightly to feel safer. She looked at the clock on the dashboard, and it was almost 5 o'clock. The pool wouldn't open on time today, and she might lose her job. But at that moment, she saw an exit up ahead. Overwhelmed with relief, she took it without caring where it led. She just wanted to get off that never-ending road. Joan's heart raced as she drove down a long, curvy ramp onto a new road. This road seemed more connected to civilization because it had street lamps, small motels, a gas station, and some eateries. However, everything looked old and not part of a big chain. It made Joan feel better, but she still wasn't close to any big city. It felt like these buildings and the road magically dropped from the sky into a forest, and nobody knew about them. Although it was all unfamiliar, at least she was in a place where she could find people. Joan started feeling a bit hopeful, but then she got worried. Would stopping here at 5 o'clock in the morning be safer than where she came from? Not trusting the place, she parked in a big lot under a rusty street lamp. The lot looked useless, with faded paint, and the building on it had boarded up windows and doors. It made her uneasy, and she didn't want to stay there for long. She decided to call her brother, who she thought cared about her more than her parents. He might be annoyed about waking up early, but would probably laugh at her for being scared. Joan searched for her brother's number on her phone, but hesitated. Would he even know how to find her if she didn't know where she was? She needed to figure out her location first. She tried to use Google Maps, but right before she found it, her phone vibrated, and the screen went black. She stared at the phone in disbelief. It was now useless. She usually charged it before sleeping, but last night, she forgot because she was mad at Austin and had to cover his shift. Feeling defeated, she put the phone in her pocket. There was no choice now. Joan had to get out of the truck, find someone to help her go home, and hopefully tell this story to someone who cared and would laugh with her. Maybe her parents, her more successful brother, her friends, or even a loving husband, if she dared to dream. Joan was lost in her thoughts as she reached to start the truck. Just as she was about to turn the key, she saw something move in her rearview mirror. A shadow flashed across her face. She got scared and quickly shifted the truck into drive, speeding towards the nearest building, a diner across the road. In the diner's gravel parking lot, Joan hesitated to leave the truck, worried there might be a threat outside. She tried to calm herself, thinking it might have been a stray animal, but the shadow seemed too big. The diner suddenly lit up, and Joan felt relieved seeing an old lady inside. The diner was opening for breakfast, and the clock on the radio showed it was 5:20. Joan was disturbed that it was still so dark, as if dawn was delayed. After a few minutes, Joan finally got out of the truck, thinking whatever she saw across the street was gone. She rushed to the diner and almost pulled the door off its hinges in her anxiety. The old woman inside, who had been sweeping, was surprised and almost fell over. Joan quickly apologized, explaining she was lost and asking for help. The old woman kindly offered to seat her for a hot breakfast. Joan realized how hungry she was and hesitated. There was no rush to get home or go to work. The morning lap swimmers had probably given up by now. However, soon her boss would be wondering what happened to her. She smiled at the lady, who directed her to a table without her even asking. Sitting at the table, Joan politely asked the lady, "Thank you very much, ma'am, but do you have a phone I could use? I was supposed to be at work, and I should probably call to explain what happened." The lady looked almost amused and laughed, saying, "Honey, there's no need for a phone out here. People only come to these parts to get out of them. No one stays for long, they all pass through, and as quick as they can. I don't know anyone around who bothered to have a telephone put in. I doubt the lines even reach out here. No service for them newfangled cellulars, neither." She then took out a pad of paper and clicked a pen, not noticing Joan's disappointment. "Now what'll it be, sugar?" It took Joan a moment to come back to her senses, still surprised at her luck. "Oh, just some eggs and coffee," she said, absent-mindedly biting her nails. The woman smiled, took away the menu that Joan never touched, and went into the kitchen. Joan rubbed her neck, now worried that she might get fired if her boss didn't get an explanation soon. She couldn't afford for that to happen. She imagined herself pleading with her parents, and them laughing at her. Joan assured herself that there must be a phone somewhere nearby. There had to be a big, civilized town with businesses, not little cell phone ones like these in the countryside, that would have phones. There had to be people who didn't seem like characters in a dream. "Mavis, you got raccoons again. Swear I saw one scurrying around that yellow truck parked out there." The lady rushed out of the kitchen and slammed a coffee mug onto Joan's table, spilling some of it. "Really? Darn it, Luke. That's the 4th time those little troublemakers have been around this week. You sure you don't know any way to get rid of them?" Joan looked up from her drink, and suddenly, her bad day turned into a dream. A tall young man in a leather jacket, boots, and a baseball cap was walking toward her. "Sure I do," he laughed at Mavis, who blushed. "What I don't know is how to keep him from coming back." He turned to Joan, smiling and resting his hand on her table. "Well, hey there, miss. Haven't seen you around these parts." Joan was so happy to see someone in this strange place. "I'm not from here, actually," she managed to say. "Lost." The man gave a goofy smile. "Shoulda known. Never seen a pretty girl like you wandering around here." He extended a hand, and the leather of his jacket crackled. "Name's Luke," he beamed, and Joan shook his hand gratefully. "I'm Joan," she said shyly, trying to explain what happened without sounding silly. "I'm just passing through, on the way to work." "Thought you said you were lost?" Luke pointed out. She blushed. "True," she admitted. "I'm a little turned around. If anybody comes out here, he sure ain't headed in the right direction," Luke explained seriously. "Only reason I'm here is 'cause I come every morning for Mavis's cooking, usually after hunting." He laughed. "Much better than Mama's cooking ever was." Joan perked up. Mavis, who went to fry some eggs, came to serve her, but she didn't even notice. "So, you're from around here? I mean, there's a town nearby, with phones?" Luke looked confused. "What, girl? You ain't never seen no phone or town before?" The logical part of Joan's brain kicked in. This guy could help her get out of this mess. "Please," she begged, "you'll have to let me follow you into town. If I could just use your phone, get some directions back home, I could." "Whoa, slow down, girl," Luke said, holding up his hands. "Now, where's it you're from?" She told him, but he'd never heard of it, which wasn't surprising. "Not at all?" Joan asked desperately. "Not even what direction I'd go in to get back." Mavis came up to her, patting her on the shoulder. Now, sugar. Don't you worry. My mama always told me, long as you're still in the country, you ain't lost. This idea, even if it wasn't completely true, comforted Joan. Mavis added, now, to get yourself out of this mess, why don't you go with good old Luke into town? We could get on my phone or my laptop and look up directions for you, Luke said gently. Joan thought about it. Luke seemed trustworthy, judging by his good looks alone. But she had trusted good looks before, and it got her into trouble. On the other hand, Mavis seemed genuine and caring. If she trusted Luke, why shouldn't Joan? Mavis knew him well, seeing him in the diner every morning. Joan sighed, knowing she couldn't ignore going to Luke's town. She had no phone and no way of knowing where she was or calling for help. Even if she found someone with a phone, it wouldn't get service, as Mavis had said. Finally, she said to Luke, all right, I'll just follow you to your place, then. Luke smiled and winked, saying in an overly happy tone, yeah, pretty girl. Follow me, you'll be all right. Feeling a bit uneasy, Joan wondered what other choice she had. She and Luke walked side by side, with Mavis waving at them as they left. Eggs on me, sweetheart. Good luck to you, sugar. Mavis shouted, and Joan looked back at her with a thankful smile. Outside, dawn was finally breaking, though it was still pretty dark. I really appreciate this, Joan said, and Luke just kept grinning and saying, it's all right, pretty little thing. It's all right. She ignored him and got into her truck. Once his truck was ready to leave, waiting on her, she cranked the engine. Nothing. She tried again and again. Glancing up, she saw Luke tentatively rolling out. Then, she noticed her fuel gauge. The needle was below E, and it wasn't moving. She didn't feel discouraged. At this point, she expected something like this to happen. She got out, and Luke rolled down his windows when she came up to the side of his truck. What's wrong? He asked, looking truly concerned. I'm out of gas, said Joan hopelessly. Luke quickly made light of it. No worries, pretty thing, he said cheerfully. I have a gas can up at the apartment. Why not hop in with me, and once we find out where you need to be headed, we can fill your truck up and send you on your way. Joan gulped. Getting into the same truck as Luke was something she'd intentionally avoided by suggesting she follow from behind. After all, she didn't really know him, and he could take her anywhere and do anything to her once he had her. It felt like she was submitting herself to a kidnapping. But again, what other plan was there? Her emotions stirred, and she quickly decided that she could accept Luke as her Prince Charming come to the rescue. Without reservation, she climbed into the truck. Not surprisingly, Luke's apartment, along with the rest of civilized society, was far from the diner. After driving miles down the main road, which got worse as they went farther along, they reached the edge of the surrounding forest. It seemed like the road builders had given up, letting nature consume where the road would lead next. Joan's heart pounded as she wondered if Luke had purposely taken them to a dead end. But then, he turned down a small dirt road hidden behind the trees. It's the only way I know of to get to that diner, Luke explained. Found it when I was out hunting one day. With curiosity, he asked Joan, by the way, how'd you manage to get yourself over in those parts? Joan really didn't have a clue herself. She told the whole story of how she needed to cover the early shift and how she'd missed her turn onto the interstate. Luke again asked where she was from, and, again, when she told him, he just shook his head in utter confusion. Well, he said, I reckon people got to come by that little patch of nowhere somehow. I've seen one or two characters come down to the diner, always shook up, but once they leave, they never come back. He laughed. I'm Mavis's one and only regular, you know. Luke took a deep breath, then sputtered out his mouth, at a loss for an answer. Been there as long as I've been coming. Never talks about home, never seems to leave. I once stayed at that diner till midnight or so to see when her shift ended, and it was like she just had no intention of going, just talking and talking to me till I got tired and went. Never see any car of hers parked out there neither. Joan shuddered, positive that Mavis wasn't at that diner by choice, that something or someone had trapped her there, despite her cheerful demeanor suggesting otherwise. This thought soon left her as the sun, thank God, was at last beginning to rise from behind the trees as they tumbled out from the dirt road and onto a newly paved street. Straight ahead was a tall wrought iron gate which led directly into Luke's apartment complex. Joan felt uneasy at witnessing yet more isolation. This complex was, like everywhere else she'd been lately, out in a secluded location, enclosed by trees. Regardless, the place looked clean, newly built, and safe, and as Luke politely opened the passenger's door for her when they parked, she smiled. It became less and less likely that Luke meant her any harm, even as they were silently walking up a flight of stairs to the door that led into his apartment. She didn't like how everything was so quiet and still, as if Luke was the only one who lived here. Well, she reasoned to calm herself, it was just the break of dawn. Who would be awake? She watched as he gripped the knob and turned the key, and Joan was then met with the third human face she'd encountered on this unplanned excursion. "Don't mind Curtis," Luke said apologetically as he went into another room and left her alone with him. She could hear Luke rummaging around, searching for the gas can. Curtis, a thin, pale young man with long black hair, was sitting on the couch. In his lap was an open laptop glowing in the dimly lit room. He'd been typing vigorously on it until he met Joan's eyes. He stared hard at her with a countenance difficult for her to ascertain. His face had become pained, scrunched up, almost like he was concerned or about to vomit. "Hi," said Joan with sincere kindness, though she made sure to keep a good distance. He seemed to ease up at the sound of her voice, cracking a very large smile. "Hi," he said, practically under his breath. Face relaxing, he asked, "And who might you be, miss?" Joan grinned. Curtis's voice was smooth, but not threatening or cold in the least. It also lacked the southern accent of the others she'd met, which was refreshing. "My name's Joan," she introduced. "Sorry to just barge in. I'm lost, you see, and out of gas. Luke was just bringing me by to get his gas can." Curtis started laughing, a wheezy, high-pitched laugh which was so garbled it sounded as if he were making it below the surface of a murky lake. "Oh," he said, now hiccuping from his uncontrollable laughter. "I thought you were another one of his girls." He suddenly stopped laughing, his voice becoming very quiet, almost shy. "He always brings them by, you know." Joan felt her whole body stiffen. She definitely didn't like what she'd just been told. But before she could ask Curtis more, Luke came rolling in with a satisfied smile on his face. "Found it," he said, holding up the gas can. "Sorry I took so long. Damn thing was buried under all my shit." He was reaching for the door, and Joan was about to follow him out when he abruptly turned to Curtis as if it were an obligation. Curtis peered up at him darkly, as if this was something regular that he deeply resented. "What you up to, Curtis?" asked Luke loudly in a mocking sort of way. "Still squatching on the web?" "Yes, if you must know," Curtis answered. In an almost professional voice, he said, "Hunters and trackers from all over the world are posting daily about setting their sights around here. I wouldn't doubt it if we had a colony of them. They love areas like this. In fact, I read this very interesting article today." "Ain't no Sasquatch, Curtis," Luke shouted at him. "Would have killed one by now, if there was." And without even so much as a goodbye, he slammed the door in Curtis's face. Luke was hurrying down the stairs, but Joan was stuck to the spot, almost wanting to go back in and apologize for Luke. He was at the foot of the stairs, beckoning her to come on. She wasn't quite sure if she wanted to. She finally tentatively started to descend the stairs. "Kind of harsh, don't you think?" she said flatly. Luke's face fell, like most men's do, at the horrific realization that he'd done something a girl found unimpressive. "Oh, don't worry too much about Curtis," he said defensively as he led her into his truck. He got in and cranked the engine. He's a bit of a weirdo, and not someone I'd trust. He stays up all night most nights, looking up junk about Bigfoots. Joan nearly guffawed at this, but stopped herself. Still, she said, no reason to bully people, even if they're a bit weird. Luke cringed. But Curtis, he said, almost disgustedly. Let's just say I wouldn't be living with him if I could afford it. Looking at Joan out of the corner of his eyes, he said, very seriously, sorry I left you alone with him. Wouldn't have had I not been caught up in getting the gas can. We share that laptop too, unfortunately. Gonna have to come back to print you some directions. Joan wasn't quite sure what to think of Luke's unnervingly serious tone. He definitely didn't seem bright, so he certainly couldn't have been that good of a liar. He almost sounded afraid of Curtis, as if he were dangerous. She pondered this as they climbed up the bumpy dirt road and zipped through the forest in the dim glow of the morning sun. They stumbled onto the cracking, pale tar road that led back to the diner and the gas station which were nearby. It all looked so calm in the daylight, Joan thought. Barren, yes, but not threatening as it was a few hours ago. Luke had his sights set on the gas station adjacent to the diner, for he once filled up there, or at least I think I did. Joan wasn't confident. Like everything else around, the station looked abandoned, disheveled, as though some destructive storm had blown past it. As the station approached, Luke squinted, also noticing that it looked torn apart, in a very literal sense, even. I swear, he said, it wasn't like that a while ago. I swear I filled up there, last week maybe. It all gave Joan a weird vibe. She suddenly felt unsafe again. She tried to remember the gas station as it appeared in the dark, but those memories, though they were made not long ago, were blurred by her mad haste to evade whatever had been stalking her in that parking lot. It seemed like the place had been completely intact when she barged into the diner, but there wasn't any way to be sure. And then Mavis had been attending to her, and Luke came in to tell her she had raccoons. Joan felt the truck brake to a sudden halt. She'd been looking at her feet, thinking, and when she looked back up, she expected to be in front of the gas station. But they weren't. They were in the gravel parking lot of the diner. Joan shot Luke a confused glance, but before she could ask what was going on, he forced the driver door open and sped off. She unbuckled, getting out to see what the matter was. She ran to him as he pulled the diner's door open and sprinted inside. Luke, she yelled after him. But then she stopped in her tracks and saw what his commotion had been about. The inside of the diner, she could see through the windows, looked like it had been hit by a whirlwind. The lights were swinging from their cords, flickering. Joan quickly ran inside, to find Luke wading through the destruction, calling for Mavis with a trembling, fearful voice. I can't find her anywhere, he told Joan frantically. Where the hell could she have gone? Joan felt sick. She thought her nightmare was over, but it was only just beginning. She took in the soul-crushing sights of the table she'd sat at, now overturned and thrown into the middle of the room, covered in a large, dark stain she hoped was from the coffee Mavis had slammed down, though it was awfully red. They looked at the kitchen. On the greasy grill were the charred remnants of a skillet which was billowing black smoke. Luke quickly turned the grill off before a fire broke out. The coffee maker was overflowing, and then the coffee pot, being overfull, turned over, sending a stream of boiling water to the floor, sizzling. It then rolled off the counter and landed with a crash loud enough to make Joan yelp. We have to call the cops, she said, holding her hand to her heart in panic. Can't, said Luke woefully. At least not here. No lines, no service, remember? Joan felt the strong urge to cry, but ignored it. Okay, she said imperatively, let's fill up my truck and go to your place to make the call. Girl, there's no filling it up next door, now is there? Did you see the place? It's as bad as in here. This was Joan's limit. It looked like she would never go home. Tears began welling up in her eyes and Luke noticed. Sympathetically, he came up and wrapped his arm around her. "I'm sorry," he said. "Listen, I was swishing around that gas can, and there's still some in it. Won't be enough to get you home, but we'll get you to my place at least." Joan sniffed. Pressing herself into Luke's chest, she felt comforted. She didn't want to leave him. "Why don't we get your truck out to my place so it ain't sitting out here where the something that got the gas station and the diner won't get to it? Then, we can go in my truck into town, fill up the gas can, get you filled up, get you directions, and get you on your way." Joan wrapped her arms around Luke and held him in a close hug. He hugged her back. There was nothing that could go wrong in the plan he just proposed, at least not that she could foresee. And yet, she couldn't help but procrastinate, to just stand there in Luke's arms and wonder if she'd ever see him again once she was gone. He was better than her lonely home or distant family or friends would ever be. "Actually," she said, "I think I'll just stay tonight with you." He let go of her. Uncertainly, he said, "Well, I personally wouldn't mind, but Curtis." "Luke, please. It's just I'm hungry and tired and Mavis has gone missing. I couldn't possibly go without one of us calling the cops. I need to at least know that people are looking for her." Luke considered it, then sighed. "I'm worried about her too, pretty girl," he admitted. "And you have been out late and haven't eaten a thing, have you?" He made to leave the diner, beckoning Joan to join him. He then tipped what little gas was left in the can into Joan's truck. It was just enough for her to follow him back to his apartment. When she parked, the needle was again below E, and she doubted highly that the truck would start again if she tried. Stepping out, she heard a sudden, loud creak, followed by a crash. Looking behind her, she saw that the tailgate had come unhinged, from a rusted bolt, no doubt. Piece of junk, she thought, and she slammed it back into place and climbed the stairs to Luke's apartment without a second thought. Luke opened the door for them and Joan was curious to see that Curtis was not on the couch. He left his laptop behind, shut and thrown carelessly to one side. "Where's Curtis?" she couldn't help but ask, thinking cautiously that whatever got Mavis had made us stop here too. "Out," Luke said uncaringly. "With his freaky friends, talking about Bigfoots, probably." He pulled out his phone and dialed 911 to report Mavis's disappearance, and Joan hardly listened to him as he spoke, describing the scene they'd stumbled upon and trying with great difficulty to explain how to get to the diner. From how long he talked, it seemed like he and the operator were getting nowhere. Finally, he hung up and, to Joan's confusion, was making his way to the door. "She said she dispatched cops here so they could follow me to the diner," he explained. "Says they should be here in 2 minutes tops." He opened the door. "Might take a while. Curtis doesn't get back till night, 11, usually. Till then, help yourself to any food in the fridge or get a nap." And with that, he shut the door behind him, locked it, and then relocked it for good measure, before finally descending the stairs. Joan waited until she could no longer hear his footfalls down the steps, then set on finding a place to sleep. She considered the couch, but then her eyes caught the door to Luke's bedroom. The thought of being in that bed with him on top of her was arousing enough to draw her in. She collapsed onto the bed. On Luke's nightstand lay an iPod and a pair of earphones. Perfect. Smiling and satisfied, she snuggled under the covers. She'd picked a very loud, very romantic pop song for herself, which blasted in her ears as she sank into a peaceful slumber. Hours later, the iPod had died, and there sounded a faint thud and rapid pattering that pulled Joan into consciousness. She was, as it goes without saying, a light sleeper without her music. She'd been out cold, but hadn't any idea of how long. Turning her head to face Luke's window, she found it was now dark out. She started to lift herself up, but paused when her nose caught a very coppery, musky smell hanging in the air that was so thick it was unbearable. Confused, Joan stepped out of bed. Her confusion quickly turned to a deep sense of dread as she approached the bedroom door. The smell got stronger as she came closer. Outside, she'd find what it was. Standing in the doorframe to Luke's bedroom, she saw to her bewilderment that the door to the apartment was wide open, swinging in the strong, cold wind outside. Luke was standing in the doorway, sickly looking and shivering, staring with horror at the floor. Heart pounding, eyes bulging, Joan, unable to say anything, glanced down, and what she saw made her jump and scream a terrible, high-pitched shriek. There, in a growing pool of blood, was what was left of Curtis. He had been nearly split in half just above the waist with a very crooked, deep cut. His entrails spilled out into a messy pile beside him. He'd been scalped, his skull exposed and cracked, with blood and meat issuing forth. His scalp and the hair attached was bloody and plastered to the wall and was dropping slowly as if it had been flung there. His left arm had been violently ripped off, it seemed, and his legs were twisted into unnatural positions. I knew it. Joan yelled, pointing a quivering, accusatory finger at the horror-stricken Luke. How could I have been so stupid? I knew I couldn't trust you. Joan. Luke cried to her as she fled past him. She was flying down the stairs and Luke was chasing after her. Joan. No. You think I killed him? You think I did that? He grabbed her and she struggled fiercely. Joan, you've got to listen, he pled. As soon as I got done with the cops, I came home and saw Curtis got here before I did. I meant to get here sooner so this wouldn't happen, but the cops had all sorts of questions about the diner in Mavis. Anyway, he was going in, Logan, like he was fixin' to do something to you. You're blaming this all on him, shrieked a repulsed Joan as she continued to fight. What? Killing him wasn't enough? Joan, listen. I tried to tell you Curtis wasn't any good. He ain't got no girls in that Sasquatch club of his. You was probably the first live woman he'd seen since his mama. No way he'd pass you up. Oh, that's rich. What about all the girls you always have over? He told me everything, Luke. Now, let go, you freak. I can't believe I ever trusted you. He ignored her, looking confused, but continued imperatively. He was going in and snickering like he does, when all of a sudden something came up behind me, quiet like. Curtis got real excited, chased after it. Fool was pulling out his phone to take pictures. Joan relaxed, but only slightly. Pictures, she sputtered, now more scared than angry. Pictures of what? I don't know. But we need to get out of here, Joan. Whatever it is, it didn't like the flashes from that dumbass Curtis's phone, that's for sure. Curtis tried to run to safety in the apartment, but it caught him in there and did that number on him. Don't know if he knew he was in there too, but he ran off when he heard me running up the steps. Joan couldn't bear to hear anymore. She tore her arm away from Luke and sprinted to her truck, ignoring his pleas for her to come back. She fumbled for her keys, but dropped them and fell backward upon seeing a tall, thin, hairy being emerge from the bed of her truck and tower over her. Its eyes were as big as tennis balls, perfectly round, staring down at Joan in glowing yellow. Its snout was like that of a dog's and was drooling. In its wide mouth were rows of sharp, perfectly white teeth that shone in the light of the full moon. Its hair was gray and sparse, only barely covering its skeletal body. Its head was bald and round, shaped almost like a man's. It reached down, snagging Joan in its massive paws as she screamed for help. With wide leaps, the monster glided away, leaving Luke standing there, petrified and helpless. Joan fought, trying to escape and run back to him. The pretty girl flew through the woods as if being pulled through the scariest parts of her psyche that she never wished to visit. She heard nothing but the monster's breathing and the violent rush of the wind. She could see nothing but the vague, swirling images of trees rushing past her eyes, which, in the dark, appeared as no more than shadowy figures caught up in a deranged, mocking dance which celebrated her being finally brought to her doom, phantoms whose shapes reminded her of her parents, brother, friends, and, for some reason, Austin especially, whose presence seemed to emanate throughout these woods she'd tried so hard to conquer, the woods he'd managed to trap her in, by happening to be somewhere else when he should have been at his shift. After carrying her through everything, past the ruined diner and gas station and the houses in her neighborhood and all else in its path of destruction, the creature stopped and settled in a small clearing in the forest, somewhere that Joan felt was oddly familiar. The monster sat and held Joan tightly in its arms, squeezing her and resting its wet, hairy chin on her head. Shaking to the point of convulsion, Joan's terrified eyes darted this way and that in desperation until finally looking up and seeing that her own house was right in front of them, her bedroom window, and everything that could be seen through it, perfectly visible from this angle. She'd made it home. The creature held her closer, bright yellow eyes fixed on the window in the lighted room within as if he was used to staring at it and had been staring at it like this for many, many nights before, just waiting. But now he didn't have to wait anymore. Joan whimpered, cried, and he held her closer and sighed with deep satisfaction, sending a wind of hot breath cascading down her neck. And she begged and begged to anyone who might hear her that she'd just be able to go back to that room which was streaming its tantalizing light from that window and making the thing's eyes shimmer. But she'd only be able to stare at that light, which she'd so thoughtlessly left on when she went to go to work, and that would be the last thing she saw for the rest of this night, until, at last, it and she went out.